How does the omniscient become the transcendent?
So in effect, there's a how do I create a future potential? Now, in a lot of ways, when we're talking about a future potential, it's a bit like something that could potentially be done that wouldn't otherwise be potentially done. And in effect, we're talking about a kind of technology when we're thinking about things like that. It's not the only way to do it, but it's an example. So, for instance, without a lot of existing things, this is why a minute ago, you remember I mentioned, all of the things that seemingly happened in the past, right? There's, people created microchips, and then the microchips are talking to one another on the internet. Somebody created the internet, and so on. Now, the thing about that, though, is that actually it doesn't matter how all that infrastructure got here. In the present moment, it is here. And so, in this sense, the possibility for us to communicate with one another emerges from the actuality of there being a plurality of all of this infrastructure. Now, the people that joined this call, each of you made that choice, but it was because of the possibility of all that infrastructure already being present. So any single possibility, each person being here, is a result of the plurality of all of the infrastructure in the present. You notice I don't have to reference the past of how it got here. I can only just talk about what is and what that enables. What it enables is the choice. Any one of you could have invited another person, and that person had the choice. Right? But without all that infrastructure, they wouldn't have that possibility. The possibility emerges out of the actuality of all of this infrastructure. That's a omniscient to transcendent. Omniscient being all of the infrastructure, and transcendent being the possibility to choose to invite someone and them actually being able to show up. And all of these things are kind of that way. Anything that we're talking about where how do we create a new possibility, like a new specific possibility, right? Because each person has some specific possibilities. So in effect, there's a lot of things that are enabling that new possibility to occur. And this is part of what creativity is about, right? And in effect, existence supports creation. And it doesn't have to be that elaborate. For example, the existence of a bunch of paints and a canvas supports the creation of a painting. And that painting can have the possibility of depicting something. Yeah, Paul, you got that again right. So in effect, what happens is that there is this new way of thinking about creation. Creation isn't from nothing. It's actually always from something. And this whole creation ab nihilo thing is essentially an artifact of the linearity of perception. But if we're talking about not perception as some sort of only formulated in terms of that which is perceivable, but in terms of that which is process, then essentially we can now think about the notion of creation in a circular way rather than in a linear way. And so, in effect, we start to see this interrelationship between choice, change, and creation. Or, I'm sorry, choice, change, and causation, right? That causation results in the ability for new choices. The making of choices results in changes. And those changes can be understood in terms of causation. So in effect, we can kind of generalize from regular changes to causation as a concept. We can generalize from causation taken together as the creation of new choice, and we can talk about choices as essentially the origin of change. Right? And this can go either way at this point, right? If we're starting from a third person point of view, we would say the causation was the basis of change, and the change essentially precedes choices, but in the same sort of way that change is illusionary and cause is more fundamental, we would then say that the choices that result from those changes are also kind of an epiphenomenon. And that's mostly what science has been declaring, that there's only causation. But from our point of view, that's bullshit. It's just as ridiculous as saying that there's only the perceived, there is neither the perceiver nor the perceiving. So when we start to include the notion of perceiver and perceiving as being part of the package, then the fundamental dynamic is in effect going the other way. We're now all of a sudden saying that from a first person point of view, that the observability is essentially prior to the notion of theory, right? That science itself as an epistemic method essentially says, I make firsthand observations, and from that I generalize to observable facts. And in fact, the very notion of to be scientific depends upon that particular first to third transition. The error is that in effect they said, well, now that we've got this third person position, we're going to try to generalize that, and that's where the mathematics come in. Mathematics is deterministic, and of course, if it's deterministic, there can be nothing new. So then you cut creation. And once you cut creation, well, now you've cut change. The only thing left is the determinism. And so in effect, when we're looking at this and we're saying, well, that clearly isn't work because I no longer have a first person perspective with which to bootstrap this thing, then maybe we should actually take axiom 1 seriously and say, let's consider the relationship as fundamental. Let's consider the notion of signal as fundamental. And you'll notice that this has actually happened. The very essence of what general relativity talks about is signals. Right? The whole Minkowski diagram of the time light cone and the very idea about, space-time, general relativity is the connectivity of signal motion, the connectivity of causation. And when I look at, say, quantum mechanics, I see the same thing. Signal measurement is taken as the fundamental basis. The notion of quantum mechanics doesn't mean anything at all without the notion of measurement. In fact, nothing in science means anything without the notion of measurement as comparison in the first person. So if I basically am, as a philosopher, oh, by the way, physics gave up on philosophy. That's why all of this went wrong. But basically, as a philosopher, if I notice that causation and determinism are different concepts, and I don't make the mistake of assuming that mathematics is the only language with which I can consider nature, then I'm now going to talk about causation as being the language with which I understand nature, then I don't have to exclude change and I don't have to exclude choice. I can talk about choice as being an origin for changes as much as I can talk about causation as being an origin of changes. I can think about some of what is change as being regular and some of what is change as being irregular, new. So in this sense, again, we see that the new occurs in the process, in the change. I'm not going to be able to explain all changes just in causation alone. Every change is going to involve some element of newness and some element of regularness. Some things which are defined in terms of symmetry and some aspects which are defined in terms of continuity. And this, of course, is part of the reason why the incommensuration theorem is so important, but that's downstream at this point. I'm doing a forward illusion. So if we are basically at this point starting to, as I said, think about things in the first person perspective in terms of processes, I'm noticing that I have this option to go both ways around the ring. And already when we're starting to look at the notion of creation or newness as being an aspect of events, of time as being an aspect of events, or of an aspect of process, and the process has to be held in the first person way in a more general sense, I'm noticing that there's starting to occur these indications that the ring is going the opposite direction from which we would normally think about it if we were thinking about it from a third person point of view. At first, this is just a tendency. It's just we're kind of noticing that actually it makes more sense to think about the present moment as emerging, as coming into being. And that if I'm doing that, then to some extent, I have to take the notion of creation seriously. I have to take the notion of creation as essentially being before being. And if I take that seriously, then to some extent I'm looking at the future as emerging into the present rather than the present as emerging out of the past. Now, so far, we haven't done anything that is formal. All I've done is suggested that axiom 2 flow a certain way, given the metaphors and the dialogue that we've had so far, or monologue if you decide that I've been taking up too much airspace.